My family.
Alright guys, so I'm really excited about today's review because I really enjoyed The Family Upstairs. I've read probably 5 Lisa Jewell novels. For the most part, have been incredibly impressed. I think technically she is a popular fiction author, but the ones I've read have largely been mystery. There was one that I read that I really didn't like. I think there's various reasons for the reason I didn't like it, but it was not a mystery, and so maybe for me, that's where she should stay. This one right here, actually, The Girls in the Garden, I've been meaning to read this for over a year, and I'm like 1/4 of the way through. Part of that is because it's a physical book, and so it's just harder for me to get around to those. Also, it's just a little bit slower. That just doesn't do it for me. But this one actually kind of started out the same way, so maybe I should give The Girls in the Garden a little bit more leniency and get back into it and see if it'll eventually draw me in. With that, let's get into it. The Family Upstairs, it revolves basically around the mystery of what happened to these people in a house. Okay, that sounds really bad. Let me start that over, okay? That sounds super bored. I keep getting this wrong, which is embarrassing considering I'm all about language, right? The basic premise of The Family Upstairs revolves around a young woman named Libby who, upon her 25th birthday, has inherited this really fancy house from her biological family. What do I mean by that? Well, it turns out that when Libby had been a baby, she was adopted because her biological parents had committed suicide as they had been part of a cult. Part of the story is learning the truth behind those deaths. But then the other part of the story is, well, what happened to the kids that had been in this house? Because Libby had siblings, and then it's assumed that the other members of this cult had children as well. So, out of all the people that had been living in this house, where are they? We have some of the adults, but what about the children? The entirety of the novel is getting the answers to those 2 questions. Why did the parents commit suicide? And then, where did the children go? That said, I thought this book started pretty slow, and I only gave it credence because I enjoyed her other novels so much. I figured, what the hey, I'll just get on with it, I'll finish it, out of respect for Lisa Jewell, and I'm really glad I did, because she pulled it out in the end. I think my initial problem was that it was slow. You're given this information that her family was part of a cult. So I'm thinking, this is going to be really interesting. We're going to get all this like Jim Jones kind of thing, like drinking the Kool-Aid. There's going to be this huge cult, vast number of people who are involved in this, and it never gets to that. And so then my question becomes, what constitutes a cult? Is it just any number of like-minded people coming together, or does it have to have a huge constituency? I mean, like Jim Jones had his own town, essentially. Like, he had enough followers to establish his own town. But in The Family Upstairs, this cult was like 10 people max. And so I was a little let down by that. I mean, even by the end of the novel, I was not convinced it was a cult. It felt more like a group of people who were under one man's control. Yes, that sounds very cult-like, but it's not like they were moving towards anything. They just listened to this one guy and let him control their lives. So, I mean, it is kind of a big deal because their whole entire lives in this house are predicated upon the fact that they're kind of part of a cult, when I just didn't get that. But we'll leave that to later, okay? What I really, really liked, actually my 2 favorite parts of the novel, the things that I thought she did so well, outside of the crafting. Her writing, it's undisputable. Like, she knows how to write. But what I thought she did well with her writing was the twists and turns, and then Henry. The book has three narrators. There's Libby, Lucy, and then there's Henry. We aren't really sure where Lucy fits into all of this, but it's pretty clear right away that Henry is Libby's missing brother. And whereas Libby and Lucy are narrating kind of in the present, Henry is narrating from the past, or more like he's narrating with hindsight. So he's narrating from his present self about the past. So what I thought was so great about him was because we learn that he is an unreliable narrator. You really can't trust a single thing he says. But what makes it so great is the crafting, because you don't know he's unreliable until the very end, and then you're given all the answers. Like, Jewell fills in the holes you didn't know were there. And so I just thought Henry was fantastic, and I will get more into him later. I just wanted to tell you now that what made this novel so successful were those two elements. What I thought was unsuccessful, outside of the cult aspect, was throughout the novel, and this is where the twists and turns come in, there were so many moments where I thought, oh, that's too easy. She's giving us the obvious explanation, and then it wasn't obvious at all. But then there were definitely some moments where I was like, that's it? One of those moments is actually a pretty big one, so we'll start there. The big plot is about the people in this house and what happened to them. But then there's a subplot that involves Lucy. We don't know who Lucy is really. What we do know is that she is in her late 30s. She has two children, Marco and Stella, and that she's living in France. Additionally, she is destitute, yet she is trying for some reason to get her family to England, but she has all kinds of problems, largely because she has some mysterious past. She has no real means of income. She has no passport. Her children have no passports. So what is she gonna do? The subplot follows her on her journey to getting to London and ultimately to this house, where, spoiler alert, we learn that Lucy is Henry's sister and Libby's sister. The thing is, Lucy had been married to Marco's father, Michael, but Michael had been very abusive, and so she'd gotten out. Well, she realized when she had no other alternative, he was the person she needed to go to in order to get money and passports to get out. Sound easy? Well, obviously it's not. She knew, as I said, he was abusive, so she knew getting it was not going to be easy. It was not going to be just a matter of asking and then maybe giving him money. It was just going to come at a higher cost, and she had intimated that there had been marital rape. So she knew that was also a possibility, that she was going to have to sleep with him, but if that is what happened, she would just have to figure out a way to get through it. Again, not as easy as it sounds, because he does end up raping her, and in the course of this, spoiler alert, she kills him. She finds a knife and she stabs him. It's more in self-defense than anything, but still, she murders him, hides his body, gets out of Dodge, and then there we go. And I was like, that's it? And it's about halfway through the novel that she finally comes to this penultimate moment of getting the passports, facing whatever she's going to have to do to get them, and then goes on her merry way. It's also about this time that we stop getting her point of view, so I can see why there's no more follow through with that subplot, but still, even at the end, it's, spoiler alert, it's covered up with or explained away by just saying, well, she's not a suspect, and it's just assumed that he was involved with some nefarious drug dealers, and they are the ones who killed him. And I was just like, there could have been so much more tension from this. Of course, without her point of view, you would not see the tension unless somehow the other characters were seeing her odd behavior and trying to figure out, like, what's wrong with her. But I was really disappointed by how that plot was just dropped. Like, there was nothing about it until the very end, and she gets away scot-free. There are so many mysteries and hidden secrets with all the characters that you'd think that this is just her newest secret, and she's not going to get to have her happily ever after because she's going to constantly be looking over her shoulder wondering if someone's ever going to come after her, and it just doesn't happen that way. And I was like, I was just disappointed because I expect more from Jewell. I know what she can do. I've seen how she's able to plot, and she just failed that way for me. Another thing that I thought was a little too obvious and kind of empty-ended was there were a number of people in this house. Let me give you a little bit of background. The original family are the Lambs, Martina and Henry Sr. They have 2 children, Henry and Lucy, and then they end up having Libby many, many years after. They were very wealthy. However, Henry Sr. was going through the money very quickly because he has no job, so there's no way for him to recoup it. And so around the time that they are losing their money, this woman named Bertie enters the picture. And Bertie, I don't quite remember or know her connection to them, but somehow she knows Martina, and she's like, can I have a place to, like a temporary place to stay, like basically a weekend. And then, oh hey, well, my band needs somewhere to film their music video. And then actually, my boyfriend Justin and I have been kicked out of our flat. Can we stay here while we look for another place to live? And then eventually, this other family, the Thompsons, David and Sally, and then their children, Finn and Clemency. This is our cast of characters, alright? Justin, he was like a nobody character. So I don't like, because Jewell is so good at making everybody count that I could not figure out why she even included him. Except that he introduced Henry to growing things, and Henry's access to herbs and plants plays a huge role in the plot. And so I'm like, well, I guess that was his point in the novel. But with this cult aspect, so it's David who comes in and takes over everything. And when things are really becoming quite clear what David's intentions are, Justin is like, I'm getting out of here. So while Henry and Finn, we're probably like 14 or 15 at this time, are realizing things are not kosher, he's the only one who actually does anything about it. And then he just lickety splits. And there's kind of a big deal made in like Libby's perspective about how there is no information on any of these people. And so you're wondering, well, like, what happened to them? Because the only adults found were Martina, Henry Sr., and David. So you're like, well, where did Sally go? Where's Justin? What happened to Bertie? So there's all these really great questions to keep propelling the novel forward. And then we just find out that essentially Justin got out and got to live his happily ever after. It just didn't do it for me. I was very disappointed that was it. He was not nefarious. He was basically just some over-medicated natural, I don't even know, like, I really don't know what he did. He grew herbs, he sold them at the market. What do you want to call him? I don't know. A late blooming flower child? Maybe, I mean, the novel, that part of the novel took place in the early 90s, so it's not like the 70s with peace and love, right? Justin was kind of unnecessary. I don't know, I was going to say she could have completely done without him, although there was a point, sort of a turning point within the house in which Henry, the boy, he had seen Bertie and David kissing, and then he tells Finn, who then tells everybody else, and causes kind of an eruption because Sally moves out. So now we know what happens to Sally. She's like, well, I'm not standing for this. But Justin still stays. So I guess maybe his decision to stay could have added to the plot. But honestly, thinking back on it, it didn't. Because it's like it didn't even bother him that his girlfriend cheated on him and that he still lived in the same house with her. Like, he was a very minor character that I could have done without. And then, speaking of minor characters, there is Libby's love interest, and his name is Miller. So she runs across Miller because she's having a hard time finding information. She knew nothing about her birth family until she learns that she inherited this house. Miller had done this expose on the family, on the events that had taken place in this house. So she tracks him down to kind of talk about it, and they sort of go through the rest of the events together, because he's an investigative journalist, so he's like, I know how to find information. I was fine with that, but I didn't really care for their budding romance. It was unnecessary for the plot, and there was another pseudo-romance that I thought was much more important, and that is Henry and Finn. So, when Finn moves into the house, Henry, I think, is like 12, maybe 10 or 12, and automatically he's infatuated with Finn. But Finn wants nothing to do with Henry. He really could care less about Henry, not out of maliciousness, but just because sometimes people don't matter to you. Gosh, I guess over the next 5 or 6 years that they're all living in this house together, Henry's infatuation continues to grow, and Finn, I mean, every now and again, not like shows romantic interest, but shows recognition of Henry's mere presence. And then all of that leads into its own thing. I feel like this kind of a romance was much more compelling, even though it wasn't really a romance, because it shaped Henry. So now I'm gonna get into Henry, because I just can't wait any longer. What I liked, it's funny, I say I like Henry. I like the narrator Henry, not the Henry he's narrating back on. Because the Henry he's narrating back on is pretty boring, pretty basic. But it's narrator Henry who has all the layers. And it's, oh my gosh, like, okay. So, as I'd said, Justin had introduced Henry to the world of plants. During this whole novel, Libby has been referred to as the baby. Or not Libby, but we are assuming it's Libby, but there's a character that is constantly being referred to as the baby. We eventually learn that David has gotten Martina, who is Henry and Lucy's mother, pregnant. And so we're like, okay, so this is the baby. Now we're seeing how this baby that had been found in the house, who turns into Libby, we know where she come from. She knows where she enters the picture. But Henry, seeing that David is just trying to take control by having a piece of himself ingratiated into the whole situation, means he can be in charge. So he starts feeding his mother natural remedies for an abortion, and the baby dies. We're all like, oh, that's so sad. And of course, Henry is like, well, I did mean to do it, and then after it happened, I did feel kind of bad. So we're sort of still seeing him as innocent. But then we find out there's an incident with Bertie's cat, and everybody thinks that Henry is the one that killed the cat and then chopped off her tail. And he's like, I did not murder the cat. I did kill the cat, but it was an accident. Because we find out, huge spoiler alert, if you do not want to know why the adults committed suicide, leave the room, alright? So we find out that it was not actually suicide, it was Henry. What he had been doing is, the kids knew things were not right, and they knew they needed to get help. And so they come up with this plan to drug the adults and run for help. In Henry's attempts to figure out a concoction, he accidentally kills the cat. And as for the tail, he's like, well, the cat didn't need it. Because David, at this point, had taken away all of their things, like under the guise of giving to others, but he actually kept them for himself and hoarded them in his room. He had taken all of their stuff. So he's like, well, the cat didn't need it, and it was soft, so I kept it. And you're like that's a psychopath right there. Like, isn't that, they start out by killing, like, hurting young children? So hello, he killed the baby in the uterus, right? Then they murder small animals. Hell, the cat. So maybe Henry is actually a psychopath. And then we get to this point. So I had mentioned Henry's infatuation with Finn. Before David banned anybody from leaving the house, Henry and Finn had gone to this market. Finn had gotten his hands on some LSD, and so he and Henry took LSD, and they went down to the Thames. Henry ends up getting pushed in. Well, from our hindsight narration, he's like, well, actually, maybe it didn't quite go as I said. Maybe it was an accident, because initially he said Finn pushed him in because Henry would not quit looking at him. He's trying to get Finn's attention, and he's just so mesmerized by Finn's beauty, and Finn is eventually like, stop it, and then pushes him in. He's like, maybe that's not really what happened. Maybe we got into an argument because I was pestering him, because of this infatuation. Okay, so Finn got in trouble for something that wasn't really his fault. Then, it's just so many things. We're continuing to, get deeper into the spoiler thing, alright? So, this really is not a time for you to be here if you don't want it. So, Finn had gradually been growing sicker. We don't really know what's wrong with him, but he's been growing sicker, and when the parents are accidentally overdosed with belladonna, Henry ties Finn to a radiator just to keep him out of the way, because he's not of any help to them in their manic decision-making process to figure out how to handle the situation. Eventually, Henry goes upstairs to talk to Finn, and he unties him, but then he ends up falling asleep, and the next thing he knows, Finn and Lucy are gone. We'll get into that later, because it's still yet more spoilers. It's just the thing, I'm telling you, there's so many layers to Lisa Jewell's books. What we eventually learned, it was not quite that innocent. One, Finn was getting sicker because Henry was poisoning him. He's like, initially it started out as a love potion, but eventually it just became a means to an end, because if Finn wasn't going to let me have him, then I didn't want him around anymore. This is why Finn is getting sicker. And also, he didn't just go upstairs to innocently talk to Finn. He was going to kill him. He was going to finish the job. For some reason, he didn't do it. He agreed to let Finn go if Finn would let him kiss him. Essentially, if Finn would let him do to him what he's been dreaming of doing for all of these years. He does what he wants to Finn, and then he does fall asleep, and then Finn and Lucy are gone. Oh my gosh, it just keeps leading into more stuff, right? Let's talk about Finn and Lucy for a little bit, okay? The thing about Finn and Lucy, we've already established that David and Martina's baby is not Libby. So now we have to figure out, where does Libby come in? When is the baby born? Not long after Martina's miscarriage, David announces to the house that Lucy is pregnant. So we're like, because these are those obvious things that are no longer obvious. Because initially we think Libby is Henry and Martina's baby. Then we think Libby is Martina and David's baby. And then we're like, wait a minute. Libby is David and Lucy's baby. And then it's like, what? Not quite. Libby is Lucy and Finn's baby. And that's kind of what pushes Henry over the edge when he learns that Lucy and Finn have been sleeping together. Don't get all excited. There was no secret love affair. It was more of a, Lucy would go to Finn because he and his sister Clemency had been visiting their mother. And when he would come back, he would just be so upset. And then there was a point, his behavior pushed David to enforce more rules, and eventually Finn was just tied up in his room or locked in his room all the time. And so sometimes Lucy would just come to visit him because she knew how miserable he was. And they slept together a couple times. She was sleeping with David, which was something I was a little confused about. I wasn't sure if David actually thought the baby was his because they had been sleeping together, but that's a whole other ball of wax that we don't really need to get into. So the baby ends up being Finn's. When Henry goes upstairs and he releases Finn and then he falls asleep, Lucy comes upstairs because she's like, I need to take Finn to the doctor. Sidebar, at this point, Clemency has left the building. She's gotten out of Dodge. She is trying to find her mother because she's the only smart one in the group, all right? Leaving Libby in the house was not intentional. Lucy just wanted to get Finn some help, and by the time she got him to the doctor's like, well, both of you need medical care, and you need to stay here until you're healthy enough to leave. And by that point, the police had already been notified, and there was nothing more that Lucy could do. Because she's like 15, but obviously she'd been 14 when she had this baby. Anyway, she was like, the best thing to do is just to let Libby have a different kind of life. So throughout the entire book, because we're about to end here, we've had these 3 narrations, and there's been no explanation as to what happened to Finn. We're all just assuming that Finn has died. So finally, at this point, all 3 narrators have converged, and Lucy is telling Libby, as far as I know, Finn is fine. After we had gone to the doctor, after the police had been called, the doctor gets us out of there and gets us into France. We're staying with this family for, I guess, a year or 2. At some point, I wake up and Finn is gone. She had tried to find him and she couldn't, and so she's just assuming Finn is fine, and he's finally leading this anonymous lifestyle that he's always wanted. Now we are at the end of the novel, where it's Libby's birthday, and we're thinking, all right, again, okay, ultimate spoiler, all right, guys, not maybe ultimate, but another kind of spoiler, and it's just like, okay, I guess we're just gonna have a happily ever after. It's not what I wanted, it's not what I expect from Jewell, but, you know, maybe she just got tired, and she's just gonna leave it here. We're celebrating Libby's birthday. Miller, Libby's boyfriend, gives her this pamphlet, this brochure for an African safari. And he's like, I think that I found Finn. Because Finn, his dream job had been to be a safari guide. And so Miller's like, I think I found him. And there's this picture of a guy who very well could be Finn, who's looking super happy and content, you know, leading his group. Miller says, I've booked us this tour, and basically we're gonna go find him, we're gonna go meet him. It's like, oh wow, here we go. It's basically our second happily ever after. It's not just ending with the family loving each other. It's like, now we're gonna find Finn, because Finn really is alive. Insert unreliable narrator Henry, okay? A little bit of backtracking. We'd seen, it had been revealed to us that maybe the innocent wasn't so innocent when it came to him. And then, you know, in Libby and Miller's pursuit of the truth, they had found Clemency, and Clemency had made a comment about, I don't think Henry is all there. Like, I think he's more evil than people realize. And so we still don't quite know what's truth and what's not truth. Like, are all those things Henry did, were they really malicious? Or were they because he was a budding psychopath? You know what I'm saying? We learn this information about Finn, and then we get to Henry's perspective. And he's like, you know what? All this crap that Lucy fed us about how happy they'd been in France and about all the happy moments that they talked about, and I just don't believe it, because I don't believe Finn ever cared that much about anybody beside himself, which translates into he didn't care about me the way that he should have. So he's like, basically, can I come with you on your safari? and we get this idea that maybe he's gonna go finish the job. He's gonna kill Finn, because Finn does not deserve to be happy, because Finn does not deserve to have spent the last 25 years thinking about himself and doing what he wants with his life without ever thinking about anyone else ever again. And it's just, I loved how we ended on that note. And another thing that had happened in the novel was Libby, you know, as soon as she inherits his house and starts coming to the house, she's very aware that somebody else has been or is in this house. And eventually, she runs into a man in the house who introduces himself as Finn. We later learn it's Henry, but by all rights, the physical clues we're given it could very well be Finn. So Henry, who claims he was not trying to make himself into Finn, but he's still completely obsessed with Finn, and now at the end of the book, he's like, can I come with you? He is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. His whole life, ever since Finn entered it, has been about Finn. Trying to basically become Finn and inhabit Finn's body. And then in the end, well, now there's Finn. Like, what's gonna happen? How is he gonna handle this? Because there's something up here that if Henry no longer exists. This is all supposition. Like, there's really nothing in the novel, but this is just me thinking, what happened to Henry? You know? And I do wonder, was this time in the cult, did that skew his thinking? Did that screw him up mentally? Because we get this impression that he's still pretty sane throughout it all. Like, he's not allowing himself to be brainwashed. Like, when David reveals that Lucy is pregnant, he takes this look at her and he realizes, you know what, she considers this an honor to be impregnated by David. And he's totally surprised because he's always been able to see through David. And so you never get the sense that he drank the Kool-Aid. One thing I don't understand is why he and Finn did not just leave. Because even though they were literally locked in this house, there was an escape route. And I don't know if at a certain point David discovered the escape route, which is why Henry and Finn never used it again, or maybe it's because even though they knew things were screwed up, this was still their family, so that's where they were going to stay. I don't really understand why they did not. Sorry, I have a hair. I never quite understood why they didn't just get out, but they didn't. So, like, maybe being trapped in that pressure cooker snapped him somehow. Or maybe his love and desire for Finn that went unrequited turned in on itself. I have no clue. I love the end result in that. We're like, wow, I was rooting for you, Henry, but you don't deserve it because you were not an innocent player. Like, personally, I doubt that he accidentally killed the adults. Which reminds me, I never talked about Birdie. So we know what happened to Justin, we know what happened to Sally, we know what happened to David, Henry, and Martina, but we don't know what happened to Birdie. And this is a little iffy for me. So he accidentally overdoes it on the belladonna, and he thinks he's killed them all. They're freaking out, and they're trying to get everything they can together, like try to find all the money and supplies, and Birdie shows up in the doorway. I guess the insinuation is she didn't drink as much as the others, so maybe she had been stunned or knocked out for a little bit and then came to. And then Henry ends up ultimately killing her. Again, it's under the guise of self-defense, but who really knows at this point? And then they hid her in it, like, I still don't understand. It's a massive house, and I guess there's something in the ceiling, in the roof, that they hid her in. She mummifies and she falls apart, and then when he has come back to the house, because he knows that when Libby turns 25, and this is also why Lucy is trying to come back, because she knows when Libby turns 25, she is going to inherit the house. So he has been keeping an eye on the house. He has been coming to the house, and so while he's at the house, he takes her bones and he throws them in the Thames, and you're just like, dude, you're screwed up. Like, you do need to get some professional help. Like, you know, he's just an amazing character. Where the others, they do have layers, but I love that I did not know there were problems or misconceptions until he told me, and then I was like, oh. That's really, really what kept me going, was how eventually Jewel she just kept piling it on, you know. Except for the very beginning when it was pretty slow, she just knew how to misdirect. And anytime an author can stump me, I will give them the golf clap. You know what I'm saying? I completely recommend this book, and I'd love to know if you've read any of the other things. I read someone else's review where they did not like one of her other books that was personally my favorite, and then this one swayed them into being more open to read her. Let me know what you think. If I left anything out and you still have questions, let me know. With that, I will see you mañana. Adios.